In the heart of Moscow, behind the closed doors of the Kremlin, whispers speak of a secret no one dares to confirm. A child, hidden from the world, living under layers of wealth, power, and silence. Who is he? And how far would those in power go to erase every trace of his existence? Tonight, we dive into Project Orion, the mysterious files, and the journalist who risked everything to uncover the truth. What you're about to see has never been fully told, until now. In the late 1990s, when Russia stood on the trembling edge between collapse and rebirth, information moved not through headlines, but through whispers. Inside the Kremlin's marble corridors and smoke-laden conference rooms, stories were currency, traded in cautious tones and coded gestures. Among the chatter about oil contracts, cabinet reshuffles, and Western sanctions, a more delicate rumor began to take shape, one that carried no official paper trail, yet refused to fade. It began, according to later intelligence intercepts, within Moscow's administrative network, mid-level aides and ministry staff exchanging short, carefully worded memos marked, for official use only. The subject line, personal details concerning the president. The language was indirect, measured. It spoke of a new household arrangement, of an individual receiving enhanced security privileges, and of sensitive domestic developments, involving a female public figure once celebrated for her national achievements. No names, no admissions, just a trace of smoke where no fire was supposed to exist. By 2001, foreign diplomats stationed in Moscow had begun to notice subtle shifts. Invitations to Kremlin receptions were suddenly more selective. A handful of senior journalists found their accreditation revoked without explanation. Among embassy circles, a quiet theory emerged, one suggesting that President Vladimir Putin, then still cultivating his image as a stoic guardian of Russian tradition, might be harboring a secret personal connection that could not withstand public scrutiny. Western intelligence services dismissed the idea at first. Putin's private life was a known blank space. His former wife, Lyudmila, had long avoided publicity, and no verified evidence hinted at impropriety. But the persistence of the story drew attention. Analysts began cross-referencing internal Russian media orders. Government-issued instructions known as temniki, which directed editors to avoid specific phrases, photographs, or names. One such directive, recovered from a media oversight office in late 2002, contained a curious omission list. Among the restricted references was a single female athlete, Alina Kabaeva. The connection was circumstantial, but notable. Alina Kabaeva, Olympic champion, national icon, and former face of Russian victory, had recently attended several official ceremonies in Moscow. Her appearances coincided with unexplained absences in the president's schedule. One report from a Western attaché described a distinct tightening of Kremlin security during her visits, with communications staff ordered to power down devices and clear hallways. Still, there was no proof, only patterns. An internal FSB document, later leaked to a German newspaper, referenced domestic containment operations regarding the suppression of unverified personal allegations at the federal level. For seasoned observers, this was the Kremlin's quiet way of acknowledging what could not be publicly addressed. By 2003, the rumor had evolved. It was no longer confined to gossip among aides. It had become an intelligence footnote, a minor but persistent annotation in reports shared between agencies. British MI6 files from the same period included mentions of a female parliamentary candidate of interest linked to restricted domestic intelligence files. And then came the whisper that shifted everything. It did not emerge from the West, nor from the press. It came from within the Kremlin itself. An encrypted message circulated among internal analysts, one line standing out from the rest. Subject, Alina. Possible connection, personal. Classified, top secret. In that moment, what had been a rumor gained weight. The circle of those who knew, or thought they knew, became smaller. Access was limited. Files were sealed. The corridors grew quieter. Yet somewhere between the typewritten reports and the silenced journalists, one truth remained unspoken but understood. In Moscow, where every secret has a watcher, some stories are too dangerous to name. One name kept appearing in coded reports. Alina. In the summer of 2004, the world watched as a young gymnast in crimson and gold took the Olympic stage in Athens. Her movements were liquid precision, ribbons slicing through the air like threads of silk, every gesture rehearsed to the edge of perfection. When the final note faded and the scoreboard confirmed her victory, the Russian delegation erupted in applause. Alina Kabaeva had delivered not just a medal, but a message. Russia, reborn from the ashes of economic turmoil and political fragmentation, could still command the world stage. State television played her performance in endless rotation, day and night, on every channel. Commentators spoke of grace forged from discipline and as symbol of the Russian spirit. Newspapers printed her photograph beneath patriotic headlines. For a nation weary of corruption scandals and conflict, she was something pure, a face untouched by cynicism, a promise that beauty and order could still emerge from chaos. But behind the pageantry, sport was never just sport. The Kremlin understood the language of symbols, and in Alina's triumph it saw an opportunity. She was invited to official receptions, first as a guest of honor, then as a recurring presence at state-sponsored cultural events. Cameras followed her into ornate halls of marble and gold, where she stood among generals, ministers, and dignitaries. It was during one such ceremony, commemorating excellence in Russian sport, that she met the man who had risen from intelligence officer to head of state. Vladimir Putin, newly re-elected and carefully cultivating his image as both reformer and strongman, extended a hand to the young champion. The handshake lasted seconds. Photographers captured the moment. Broadcasters described it as a meeting between two symbols of national strength. The footage aired that evening across Russia, brief, unremarkable to the casual viewer, yet instantly preserved in countless archives. But to some within the Ministry of Culture and State Media, it marked the beginning of a subtle shift. Within a year, directives began circulating quietly among editors. Limit coverage of Kabaeva's private engagements. Avoid personal emphasis on her relationship to political figures. Remove or replace older segments that might invite speculation. By 2006, clips of that handshake began to vanish from official databases. The online video archives of Channel 1 and Rossiya 24 were reorganized. Timestamps from the 2004 event led to error 404 screens. Public access libraries discovered blank entries where her name once appeared beside the president's. Even press photographers reported that the original negatives of the event had been requested for federal cataloging and never returned. The explanation, as always, was bureaucratic. Footage rotations, digital maintenance, outdated metadata. But to those who had seen the event firsthand, the absence was unmistakable. Something once proudly displayed was now quietly erased. Meanwhile, Alina's career transformed from athletics to politics. In 2007, she was appointed to the State Duma, joining the ranks of the United Russia Party, the political machine that sustained the president's dominance. State media now described her less as an athlete and more as a public servant, emphasizing loyalty, dignity, and devotion to national interests. Her private life remained off-limits, her interviews rehearsed and polite. Yet for archivists, journalists, and intelligence analysts watching from afar, the vanishing of a handshake raised uncomfortable questions. Why would a government so eager to display its champions choose to erase such a benign image? The answer was not recorded in any memo or broadcast directive. But somewhere in a locked Kremlin archive, a file still bears the timestamp of that moment. August 2004, Kremlin Palace, Ceremony of Excellence. The tape exists, but it no longer plays. Why would history edit out a handshake? On the evening of June 6, 2013, Russian state television interrupted its regular broadcast schedule for what appeared to be a routine cultural segment. Viewers expecting coverage of a ballet performance at the Kremlin were instead shown a short interview with the president and his wife, Lyudmila Putina, standing together beneath the gilded arches of the state palace. The atmosphere was calm, the lighting soft but deliberate, studio-controlled, sterile, almost ceremonial. The interviewer smiled, microphone in hand. The exchange began predictably. Remarks about art, Moscow's growing cultural scene, the significance of family values. Then, without warning, came the line that would mark the end of a 3-decade marriage and the beginning of one of Russia's most carefully managed narratives. Yes, this is a joint decision, Lyudmila said evenly, her eyes fixed not on the interviewer, but on the floor. Our marriage is over, Putin added. We hardly see each other. Each of us has our own life. There were no follow-up questions. The segment ended abruptly, replaced by music and a shot of the Kremlin walls. The program's website carried no transcript, only a brief headline. Vladimir and Lyudmila Putin announced separation. No official statement followed. In a country accustomed to choreographed politics, this moment was notable not for its content, but for its precision. The announcement had the hallmarks of a state operation: controlled environment, single take, no unscripted emotion. Media analysts later confirmed that only one camera was permitted to film and no independent journalists were present. Within hours, the Kremlin press office issued a standard clarification. The president and Lyudmila Putin have mutually agreed to end their marriage. No further comment would be made. Requests for documentation, divorce filings, property divisions, or official decrees were quietly declined. Inquiries to the Moscow City Court returned no records. It was as if the legal process itself existed only as an administrative formality, invisible to the public record. For a few days, the story dominated conversation in cafes and online forums. Then, it vanished. State television moved on to international affairs, energy summits, and sports coverage. Lyudmila's name stopped appearing in official schedules. Her image was removed from Kremlin web archives. Within 2 weeks, her biographical page on government sites redirected to a blank index. Foreign correspondents attempted to locate her, citing unconfirmed sightings in Moscow's Vnukovo airport and later in a villa near Biarritz, France. None were verified. By mid-June, even speculation began to fade. What remained was absence, an administrative silence maintained with bureaucratic precision. The presidential residence in Novoogryovo underwent quiet renovations. Personal staff were reassigned. When asked by a German reporter months later about his former wife, Putin responded tersely, "Everything is fine. Lyudmila is well. Our relationship is good." It was the last time he would mention her publicly. Behind the controlled presentation, however, analysts within Russia's journalistic community saw a larger pattern. The quiet divorce was not an isolated act. It was a signal. It demonstrated how even personal milestones could be absorbed into the architecture of state secrecy. Every visible trace of Lyudmila's life, her travel records, her presence at official ceremonies, even her charitable foundation, was methodically erased or reassigned. For those who followed the president's private sphere, the timing raised questions. The separation came just as rumors of another relationship were resurfacing in Moscow's inner circles. Rumors of a woman once known as the golden girl of Russian sport. But when journalists tried to pursue the connection, they found only closed doors and revoked credentials. In a nation where access equaled survival, few were willing to risk the question aloud. A week after the televised announcement, Lyudmila's apartment in central Moscow was vacated. Her phone line was disconnected. No public appearance, no statement, no photograph ever followed. Her absence was noted, but never explained. Between 2005 and 2008, a curious silence descended over one of Russia's most recognizable public figures. Alina Kabaeva, the gymnast whose performances once drew stadiums to their feet and whose smile had graced every state television broadcast, began to disappear from view. It started gradually. First came the cancellations, a scheduled television appearance postponed due to unforeseen commitments, a sports exhibition in Kazan suddenly removed from the program. By the summer of 2006, her public schedule had thinned to near nothing. Her interviews ceased. Her presence at official sporting events, once a fixture of national pride, was reduced to archival reruns. At the same time, rumors began to circulate, hesitant, quiet, and always without attribution. A story appeared briefly on a regional news website, claiming that Kabaeva was expecting a child. Within hours, the article was removed. The publication later issued a formal apology for distributing false and unethical material. Its editor resigned soon after. Other outlets received direct warnings from Roskomnadzor, the Federal Communications Agency, reminding them that the personal lives of state figures and national icons are not for public discussion. In Moscow's media circles, such language carried a clear meaning. The story was not to be pursued. To question further was to invite investigation. Behind the silence, however, official records hinted at movement. In the spring of 2007, internal Duma bulletins listed a new appointee to the United Russia Party's roster, Alina Kabaeva, former Olympic champion. The announcement arrived with no press conference, no public endorsement, no photographs. One day she was an absent athlete, the next she was a lawmaker. For journalists accustomed to tracing the trajectories of political appointments, this transition defied explanation. Kabaeva had no prior legislative experience, no record of political advocacy, and no visible campaign. Yet, within months, she was seated in the State Duma, her name printed among senior figures aligned with the Kremlin. When she did reappear before cameras, during a parliamentary session broadcast in early 2008, viewers noted her changed demeanor. Gone was the expressive grace of the gymnast. In its place stood a reserved official, measured and formal. Questions about her long absence were ignored. When asked by a foreign correspondent about her future plans, she answered with rehearsed precision, "To serve my country in any capacity required." Privately, reporters began comparing notes. Several had received anonymous calls warning them to avoid speculative reporting. One editor described a visit from plainclothes officials who confiscated hard drives containing unpublished photographs from Kabaeva's competitive years. Another publication, which attempted to reprint her archived interviews, found its servers temporarily suspended under the pretext of maintenance. The message was unambiguous. Whatever had happened between her public disappearance and her quiet political debut was not to be recorded. Within official circles, her proximity to the Kremlin became the subject of whispered speculation. Security officers were seen escorting her to closed meetings. Her residence, according to property registries, was relocated to a restricted neighborhood on Moscow's outskirts, one commonly reserved for senior government personnel. State media soon redefined her image. She was no longer the gymnast draped in national colors, but a symbol of civic duty and patriotism. Archival footage of her Olympic triumphs was edited into montages of political unity, accompanied by patriotic soundtracks. The line between sport and state blurred entirely. By 2009, Alina Kabaeva had become a ghost of her former self, visible only in official contexts, absent from the world that had once celebrated her. The public, trained to accept narrative as truth, adjusted quickly. The champion had simply moved on. But within the archives, the gap remained. 2 years of silence, missing records, and erased appearances. And then, without explanation, her name appeared again. This time, not as a performer or advocate, but as an elected deputy of the Russian Federation. A vanished athlete suddenly becomes a politician. Northwest of Moscow, nestled among dense pines and the reflective waters of Lake Valdai, lies an estate whose presence is as conspicuous for what is hidden as for what is visible. The region, known for its natural reserves and historical monasteries, has long attracted state leaders seeking privacy, but satellite imagery from the early 2000s reveals something unusual, a compound expanding at a rate that far exceeds ordinary private construction. Multiple structures, carefully aligned and partially camouflaged, appeared over the course of several years, with surrounding roads rerouted and forests selectively cleared. Analysts tracing the development noted that civilian laborers employed on the project were required to sign non-disclosure agreements extending in perpetuity and subject to federal oversight. Construction schedules were meticulously coordinated, often halting for unexplained periods, only to resume with increased security measures. By 2006, aerial photographs documented surveillance towers, perimeter fencing, and a helipad capable of accommodating presidential-class transport. The estate's security protocol, in both design and execution, rivaled that of Kremlin protective measures. FSO units, the Federal Protective Service responsible for the president's personal security, were observed conducting regular patrols in the immediate vicinity. Satellite logs showed armored vehicles entering and leaving at irregular intervals. Airspace over the region was designated restricted, with routine enforcement by Russian aviation authorities. Civilian aircraft deviating from designated corridors were intercepted or redirected. Observers concluded that the estate was treated not as a private residence, but as a federal asset with near-total operational secrecy. Local witnesses, speaking on condition of anonymity, provided further insight. A forest ranger recalled seeing a woman escorted by men in dark uniforms near the lakeshore. Occasionally, a small child accompanied her. Both were described as carefully shielded from view. Attempts to approach or photograph them were met with immediate intervention. The ranger, familiar with presidential retreats, remarked that the presence of a child in such a high-security area was unusual, entirely unorthodox. Flight records, pieced together from open-source intelligence, corroborate these accounts. Small helicopters, arriving without public flight logs, transported unidentified passengers to the property. The escorts were standard FSO personnel, ensuring that arrivals and departures remained invisible to civilian air traffic monitoring. The purpose of the estate remains speculative. Analysts note that its proximity to Valdai National Park allows both natural concealment and controlled access. The compound's layout suggests simultaneous residential, administrative, and recreational functions, multiple lodges, private docks, and enclosed gardens, all interconnected by guarded roads and hidden paths. Satellite imagery also reveals areas cleared for temporary outdoor structures, indicating flexibility for additional personnel or visitors. Investigative teams monitoring the estate's activity over several years consistently report the same anomaly. The child mentioned by witnesses appears intermittently, never documented in public records, school enrollment lists, or civil registries. Unlike typical Kremlin staff or family members, there is no official acknowledgement of this individual's presence. Every instance of the child's appearance coincides with heightened security, often involving aerial escort. Documents leaked from construction contractors confirm the depth of confidentiality imposed. Workers' identities were recorded under code numbers, deliveries routed through indirect supply chains, and all photographic equipment prohibited on site. Even in adjacent villages, residents report an unspoken understanding. Discussion of the property is discouraged, and speculation is often met with quiet but unmistakable warnings. In reviewing these findings, intelligence analysts concluded that the estate is more than a personal retreat. It is a controlled, highly monitored environment for activities deemed sensitive at the highest levels of the state. The regular movement of a woman and child under Federal Protective Service oversight raises questions about the family composition and potential significance of these occupants. The child was never logged, anywhere. In a small, dimly lit apartment on the outskirts of Moscow, an investigative journalist sat hunched over a flickering laptop. The city outside hummed with indifferent traffic, but inside, time seemed to contract around the glow of the screen. That evening, an anonymous email arrived with no sender information, no header metadata, and a subject line that read simply, Project Orion. Attached were several encrypted files, each bearing a string of alphanumeric characters as a file name. The journalist had encountered anonymous tips before, but something about this delivery triggered an immediate sense of gravity. The files themselves were locked behind multiple layers of encryption, their structure suggesting not casual dissemination but deliberate, high-level intent. Preliminary analysis of the metadata revealed an unusual connection, references to the Ministry of Property and its internal document management system. None of these files had ever been logged publicly, and the timestamps suggested they had been created over the previous 5 years. Opening one of the decrypted containers, she discovered a series of photographs, carefully labeled but deliberately ambiguous. Some depicted an unremarkable lakeside residence, its coordinates matching the Valdai region. Others contained images of documents marked with coded identifiers, names, financial references, and faint, partially obscured logos. Certain entries hinted at offshore trusts, shell accounts, and property ownership indirectly linked to high-ranking officials. Names had been redacted, yet the patterns suggested one central figure was being protected. The journalist approached the material with cautious detachment, cross-referencing each document against publicly available records. The offshore accounts were traceable only to a limited degree. Corporate filings in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands suggested a family trust with an unusually convoluted ownership structure. Every link led to another layer of abstraction, intentionally obscured, but the sequence implied a private network maintained at the highest level of government. Within the newsroom, discussion quickly became tense. Editors debated the implications of publishing any part of Project Orion. On one hand, the files could constitute the most significant insight into the private life of a sitting Russian leader in decades. On the other, exposure could invite severe consequences: revocation of press credentials, legal action, or worse. Some colleagues urged patience, advocating verification and consultation with international media partners. Others feared the story might be lost if the files were seized or corrupted. Verification proceeded meticulously. Digital fingerprints in the file headers were compared against previous leaks known to originate from federal sources. Certain internal references corresponded with satellite imagery of the Valdai estate, cross-checked against shipping and construction manifests. Even then, every confirmation carried caveats. Nothing could conclusively prove the identity of the occupants, yet the circumstantial evidence was compelling. The journalist had intended to work overnight, securing her progress and backing up the files to a separate encrypted drive. Around 3 a.m., however, a subtle anomaly occurred. A small notification blinked in the corner of her screen, indicating that the drive had been accessed remotely. She had taken every standard precaution: air-gapped storage, multi-factor authentication, VPN tunneling. Yet the access log suggested a sophisticated intrusion. No error messages appeared, no files were altered, but the implications were clear. She ran forensic scripts and checked system logs. Timestamps confirmed what she feared. Someone else had already been inside her computer, browsing the Project Orion files. The intrusion was neither amateur nor accidental. The precision indicated a well-resourced operator with intimate knowledge of Russian cybersecurity protocols. For the first time, the journalist realized the stakes were higher than anticipated. The files were not just documents. They were signals, monitored and guarded by unseen forces. Any misstep could be observed. And yet, the magnitude of the information demanded attention, documentation, and eventual disclosure. Someone else was already inside her computer. By late autumn, the journalist had begun to recognize the rhythm of surveillance, a choreography of repetition that only the watched can discern. The same white sedan parked 2 buildings down from her apartment every morning, its windows tinted, the driver perpetually half visible through reflections. Another vehicle, a dull gray van, lingered outside her newsroom whenever she worked late. At first, she rationalized the patterns as coincidence, a byproduct of her own fatigue. But the intervals were too precise, the timing too deliberate. Her phone, once reliable, had developed peculiar habits. Calls cut out mid-sentence. Background static swelled at random. During one interview with a former ministry contractor, the connection dropped entirely after she mentioned the phrase Project Orion. When the line reconnected, her contact refused to speak further, his tone clipped and fearful. "They hear everything now," he said quietly, before ending the call. In Moscow, surveillance was an old language, one that few dared to translate aloud. Citizens had grown accustomed to the quiet presence of watchers, the idea that every digital exchange could be observed, archived, or deleted. Yet for the journalist, the abstraction had become tangible. She began to note the patterns in her notebook. Identical license plates spotted in different districts, the faint delay between dialing a number and hearing the first ring, the subtle echo when she played back her voicemail. At night, she adjusted her blinds twice before sleeping, ensuring no direct view into her apartment. Even then, faint red lights appeared intermittently in the alley below, the glow of an idling dashboard, or perhaps something else. Sleep became fragmented, her dreams haunted not by what she'd uncovered, but by the silence surrounding it. One afternoon, an email arrived from an encrypted source she hadn't contacted before. The sender identified themselves only as a telecom insider. The message was short, clinical, devoid of preamble. "Your line has been flagged under Category 3 surveillance, full intercept and location tracking. You should assume all digital channels are compromised." The message included a timestamp and a code referencing an internal monitoring protocol used by Roskomnadzor, the Federal Communications Authority. The journalist verified it against previous leaks. It was genuine. The realization was immediate and cold. She wasn't just being followed, she was being cataloged. When she arrived at the newsroom the next morning, her editor was waiting. His posture was rigid, the air between them sterile with tension. He didn't offer a greeting, only a warning delivered in a measured, bureaucratic tone. "They've made contact," he said. "No direct threats, but the message is clear. Drop it." She wanted to argue, to insist that truth carried its own protection. But even as she opened her mouth, she saw the resignation in his eyes. The newsroom had received an official inquiry from a government liaison, requesting the temporary suspension of investigative materials pertaining to state property records. It wasn't an order, but it didn't need to be. The editor's voice softened slightly, almost human now. "We're journalists, not martyrs," he said. "End it before it ends you." That evening, the journalist sat at her desk in the half-dark, her laptop screen reflecting her own weary face. The city hummed outside as it always had, indifferent and mechanical. She thought of the files, of the unseen operators who had already stepped through her firewalls, of the van idling somewhere beyond the streetlight's reach. In the stillness of her apartment, she finally admitted what she had resisted for weeks. The investigation was no longer hers alone. And then her editor told her to stop. The newsroom was empty save for the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint clatter of her own keystrokes. Outside, Moscow's streets were deserted, wet asphalt reflecting the occasional street lamp. She sat alone at her terminal, fingers hovering over the keyboard, staring at the encrypted files that had consumed months of her life. Her editor's warning echoed in her mind. "End it before it ends you." But months of careful accumulation, Project Orion, satellite imagery, offshore accounts, mysterious estate activity, had built to a point she could not ignore. She knew the files could vanish overnight, seized or corrupted by unknown operators. She had one chance to send a signal. At precisely 23:17 local time, she drafted a single line for publication. Evidence points to a hidden heir, possibly living under state protection in a private residence near Vladimir. No analysis, no speculation, no photographs, just the statement. She uploaded it to her personal, encrypted social media account and pressed post. Within minutes, the metrics began to climb. Despite the absence of multimedia content, the phrase resonated. Analysts monitoring social media later reported over 2,000 shares in under 10 minutes. Western outlets, scanning Russian feeds for anomalies, picked up the line within the hour. Headlines appeared in London, Berlin, and Washington referencing a hidden heir tied to the Kremlin. Her heartbeat accelerated. She watched the analytics spike, the cascading retweets, and the sudden influx of comments, some curious, others conspiratorial. Every notification was a reminder that the world had noticed, that the wall of secrecy was cracking. By 23:42, less than 25 minutes after publication, the post vanished. Her account displayed a generic error, content unavailable. System logs later indicated deletion originated from a state cyber unit, capable of tracing the source while leaving minimal residual footprint. Within an hour, her email inbox flooded with automated security alerts, unsuccessful login attempts, redirected traffic, IP anomalies, evidence that the breach had triggered a coordinated response. At 1:10, the Kremlin press office issued a statement. The denial was swift, unusually so. Any claim of an unregistered family member of the president is categorically false and constitutes disinformation. Russian state institutions have verified the facts. The tone left no ambiguity. The window for public questioning was effectively closed. Within 24 hours, her press credentials were revoked, removed from internal media registries, and replaced in official databases with a suspended status. Attempts to access the newsroom archives remotely were blocked, with access logs showing repeated intervention by unidentified state units. By 3 o'clock, her phone, once a lifeline to colleagues and sources, went dark. No calls connected, no messages delivered. Repeated attempts to reach her personal line were met with silence. Analysts later reconstructed that the device had likely been remotely disabled, a standard measure to prevent further communication while maintaining surveillance. Even as fear edged her thoughts, she noted the patterns she had trained herself to see. The deletion, the denial, the rapid suspension, they indicated not only awareness but control. Someone within the state apparatus had tracked her every move in real time. Her actions had been observed, assessed, and contained before they could escalate. Yet, despite the immediate suppression, the seed had been planted. International media carried fragments of her statement, analysts debated the plausibility, and intelligence circles filed reports that would never be made public. The leak, small and measured, had created a ripple impossible to fully erase. She sat in the quiet newsroom, monitors dimmed to a low glow, and understood the truth. The line she had published was no longer hers alone. It had entered the world, and the response it provoked confirmed one inescapable fact: Project Orion was being watched. That night, her phone went dark. At 22:43 on a rainy November evening, CCTV footage from a Moscow parking garage captured the journalist entering her vehicle. A silver hatchback, license partially obscured by water droplets on the camera lens, reversed out slowly, wipers slicing through the downpour. Streetlights reflected off wet asphalt, creating long, blurred streaks in the footage. For the next 12 minutes, all GPS signals from the vehicle disappeared. Cellular triangulation later confirmed a temporary blackout of both mobile and navigation devices, suggesting either deliberate interference or systemic failure. At 22:55, the hatchback reappeared on CCTV, traveling north along a sparsely monitored suburban thoroughfare. Headlights pierced the fog and rain. The windshield wipers moved methodically. The footage shows no other vehicles in close proximity. Observers later noted subtle deviations in steering, brief veering that appeared inconsistent with weather conditions or road layout. By 23:07, emergency services received a report: a single vehicle collision near a forest road approximately 35 kilometers outside the city. Responding officers arrived to find the car partially embedded against a tree, the front crumpled, airbags deployed. Rain continued to fall, mixing with leaked oil and brake fluid along the roadside. The journalist was unconscious but alive. She was extracted and transported to a regional hospital. Initial police reports indicated minor internal injuries, but no trauma suggesting foul play beyond the crash itself. The official documentation stated mechanical failure as the cause. Investigators noted worn brake pads and a corroded master cylinder, concluding that sudden brake loss had precipitated the accident. Photographs in the report illustrate tire tracks leading directly into the tree with minimal skid marks. Standard forensic notation accompanies each image: measurements, angles, distances meticulously recorded. The file was filed under routine classification and labeled case number 1137, OV. However, an independent mechanic, contracted privately by colleagues concerned with the journalist's well-being, later conducted a secondary inspection. The mechanic reported that the brake lines had been deliberately severed. The cuts were clean, consistent with wire snips or precision tools, and showed no signs of natural wear or corrosion. The discovery contradicted the police report entirely, raising questions about the integrity of the initial investigation. No official acknowledgement of tampering was recorded. The file, containing CCTV stills, police photographs, and witness statements, was sealed by the morning under the classification restricted, inaccessible to the public and press. Attempts to retrieve the document through legal channels were met with denials, citing national security concerns. Metadata on digital copies indicated early tampering with timestamps, suggesting coordinated interference. Local witnesses reported a single figure in dark clothing observing the wreck from a distance before leaving the scene. No identification was possible. The individual was never traced in follow-up police interviews. Road maintenance cameras along the route captured nothing unusual beyond the journalist's vehicle. The forest road itself remains lightly monitored, with intermittent cell tower coverage, consistent with the GPS blackout. In hospitals and press circles, speculation spread quietly. Colleagues noted that the journalist had previously expressed concern over personal safety, referencing encrypted files, Project Orion, and unexplained cyber incursions. No written threat had ever been made public, yet the sequence of events, digital intrusion, revoked credentials, surveillance, and finally, the crash, suggested a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence. By mid-morning, the file labeled case number 1137, OV, was sealed within a federal archive. The details of the vehicle examination, eyewitness accounts, and mechanical analysis were classified, leaving only fragments for independent investigators to reconstruct. The file was sealed by morning. Within hours of the journalist's death, the machinery of information control mobilized with precision. Russian state and affiliated media began a coordinated purge of any reference to her work, her investigations, or the Project Orion files she had hinted at. Headlines vanished, URLs returned 404 errors, and social media accounts linked to her posts were suspended or redirected. The effect was near total, a blackout that stretched across digital, print, and broadcast platforms. Editors in multiple Moscow newsrooms were the first to feel the pressure. Phone calls from government liaisons instructed immediate compliance. Those who hesitated or questioned the orders were quietly removed from their positions. Within 2 days, at least 4 senior editorial staff submitted resignations, citing personal reasons in official statements. Colleagues reported that emails detailing the takedown process had been circulated under strict confidentiality, with threats of legal consequences for noncompliance. Websites hosting archives of her articles were seized or disabled. Domain registrations were revoked under Ministry of Communications directives, often citing vague violations of content laws. Backup servers containing historical data were physically confiscated or rendered inaccessible through administrative locks. International servers hosting mirrored copies faced digital interference, including targeted distributed denial-of-service attacks and automated content removal requests framed as copyright claims. Simultaneously, the state's narrative apparatus went to work. A statement from the Kremlin press office framed the entire sequence as the product of foreign misinformation campaigns, accusing unnamed external entities of attempting to destabilize domestic reporting. Public television repeated this explanation in carefully edited segments, emphasizing that the journalist's work had never reflected verified facts, and framing Project Orion as speculation amplified by hostile foreign media. Individuals connected to her reporting were not immune. Colleagues who had assisted with preliminary analysis faced summons from federal authorities. Several junior reporters, editors, and IT staff were detained briefly for questioning regarding distribution of unverified materials. Those released were cautioned on potential criminal liability under laws regulating state secrets and defamation of public officials. The deletion process extended to digital archives. Server logs indicate that takedown scripts were executed sequentially across multiple domains, accompanied by metadata scrubbing to remove user access histories, timestamps, and previous edit logs. In certain instances, archival footage of her interviews, public speeches, and social media posts was overwritten with innocuous content. Internal audit trails suggest these operations were coordinated from a central communications command center, with automated monitoring confirming compliance across all platforms. Yet, anomalies appeared. Foreign servers, particularly in Western Europe, had captured cached versions of her articles mere minutes before the takedown commands executed. Journalists in London, Berlin, and New York were able to retrieve fragments, stored on mirror sites and personal repositories. These caches contained the original phrasing, references to a hidden heir and the Valdai estate, accompanied by limited metadata and partial investigative notes. Although incomplete, they preserved enough to confirm that the journalist's research had been substantive and, prior to deletion, publicly accessible. Observers analyzing the sequence of events noted the dual nature of the operation. One component eliminated traces domestically, while the other, perhaps inadvertently, ensured that copies survived abroad. In effect, the state achieved control over the narrative at home, but could not entirely erase the record from the global network. By the end of the week, the blackout was complete. Newsrooms were silent, servers emptied, and editors replaced. The Project Orion trail had been suppressed. Someone had made sure her words survived. By mid-2014, fragments of Project Orion had begun to surface beyond Russia's borders. Exiled journalists in Geneva and Zurich, long accustomed to covering Kremlin affairs from a distance, received a carefully encrypted email from a previously unknown source. The message arrived with no sender metadata, only a PGP-signed attachment labeled Project Orion, partial extracts. The contents were fragmented but striking. Photographs of documents, scanned ledgers, and partial spreadsheets suggested financial transfers routed through a series of offshore entities. Several entries referenced children registered under different surnames, subtle placeholders that shielded the identities of actual beneficiaries. There were cryptic notes in Russian, citing residency assignment and personal allowance allocation, indicative of meticulously maintained private accounts. Exiled reporters convened in dimly lit cafes along the Rhone, laptops open, screens glowing against the gray winter light filtering through frosted windows. Conversations were conducted in muted tones, encrypted chat logs, and secure VoIP calls the only channel for sharing sensitive details. Analysts cross-referenced the Swiss banking records with public corporate registries, identifying shell companies registered in Cyprus, the Cayman Islands, and Malta. Each entity was layered with intermediaries, designed to obscure ultimate ownership and control. One particular company drew attention: a small management firm that had handled payments linked to property renovations, utilities, and lifestyle expenses for an unidentified private estate. The signature authorizing transactions belonged to an individual once known as Alina Kabaeva's personal aide, a person who had vanished from public view around the same time as her political appointment. Analysts noted the precision of the matching signatures. The digital and handwritten identifiers aligned across multiple documents, suggesting that the aide retained operational control even after Kabaeva transitioned fully into politics. Anonymous Russian expatriates provided context. Former ministry employees, speaking under strict non-disclosure conditions, confirmed that such offshore entities were a standard method for managing private family assets within high-level political circles. They described practices involving proxy accounts, fiduciary trustees, and encrypted transaction logs, precisely the methods observed in the leaked extracts. One former finance officer remarked, "They operate like a shadow bank. Everything is visible only to those authorized. All else is noise." Investigators traced financial flows back through multiple intermediaries. Payments originating from these shell companies could be linked to Moscow-based accounts, ultimately funneling toward institutions closely associated with the presidential office. While direct attribution remained impossible without access to classified domestic records, the patterns were unmistakable. The ultimate beneficiary of these transfers was tied to the state, and by extension, to the private interests of those in power. The exiled journalists compiled the findings into a detailed dossier, cross-referencing timestamps, banking confirmations, and partial metadata from the encrypted files. Even incomplete, the trail formed a coherent pattern: concealed family assets, offshore trust management, and children enrolled under pseudonyms, all shielded by the apparatus of state oversight. Every lead, however, carried the weight of risk. The source in Switzerland emphasized operational security. Any misstep could compromise the investigation or expose collaborators still residing in Russia. Yet the fragments confirmed one vital fact: the journalist who had been silenced in Moscow had succeeded in seeding evidence outside the country. As analysts reviewed the final entries of the extracted documents, a single, chilling annotation stood out: a series of transfers from a Moscow account, timestamped during official working hours, linked directly to one of the shell companies. The dossier concluded with a stark note in the margin: the money trail leads back to Moscow's presidential office. In the quiet corridors of a private boarding school near Lake Geneva, the first verifiable traces of the hidden family began to emerge. Exiled journalists, collaborating across borders, had painstakingly traced a series of enrollment records that seemed ordinary at first glance. Children registered under innocuous, Western-sounding names, their files marked with Swiss residency numbers. But the anomalies were subtle and persistent. Diplomatic status was consistently cited in place of normal guardian contact. Travel permits listed embassies as points of origin, and parentage fields were redacted or obfuscated. Field investigators captured a series of surveillance photographs over several weeks: small armored cars and diplomatic vehicles arriving at the school gates, drivers wearing formal identification badges consistent with Federal Protection Services. The children, escorted discreetly through side entrances, were rarely seen without an adult chaperone. Class schedules, holiday itineraries, and extracurricular activities appeared normal on paper, yet access to these records required overcoming Swiss privacy barriers, an extraordinary level of legal protection, even for children of diplomats. Travel documentation reinforced the pattern. Multiple passports were issued under alternate identities, showing frequent short-term international trips. Names changed across different visa applications, but consistent dates of birth indicated two children of similar age and origin. Airline manifests, acquired via investigative collaboration with European media outlets, confirmed their movements without revealing parental information. The logistics suggested meticulous planning and substantial resources, a network capable of supporting children under constant surveillance while maintaining plausible deniability. Forensic attention turned to indirect evidence of family ties. A discarded coffee cup from a diplomatic reception was collected discreetly and sent to an independent lab under strict chain-of-custody protocols. DNA extracted from residual saliva matched partial sequences consistent with publicly available genomic profiles attributed to Vladimir Putin, as cross-referenced through ancestral databases and distant relatives. Experts cautioned that the sample alone could not be used for public confirmation, yet in conjunction with the school records and travel patterns, it created a compelling probabilistic link. Multiple international journalists corroborated these findings, sharing photographs, financial transfer patterns, and property records consistent with the children's care and education. Cross-border communication highlighted anomalies that would have been invisible to domestic investigators. Coordinated banking activity, supporting private schooling, rental contracts for residential estates abroad, and unexplained travel expenses attributed to diplomatic immunity. Each piece reinforced a network designed to conceal identities while ensuring access to resources and state protection. Analysts compared these observations with previously collected Project Orion fragments. The offshore accounts and shell companies appeared to fund logistical requirements, tuition, housing, travel, and staff salaries. Children were integrated into elite educational environments, shielded from public scrutiny, and closely monitored by state-appointed security. Every detail indicated that the operation was carefully orchestrated to preserve anonymity, while permitting normal development within an international framework. Yet the risks of exposure remained extreme. Publicly releasing the DNA evidence, school affiliations, or travel documents could provoke legal action, diplomatic retaliation, or forced exile. Sources within the investigative network repeatedly emphasized discretion. Verification was permitted only for internal reporting among trusted collaborators. Despite the strong circumstantial evidence, every confirmation came with a cautionary note. In Russia, revealing even unclassified information regarding the family of the head of state carried existential consequences. The dossier concluded with a restrained observation: two children, living abroad, enrolled under assumed names, traveling on protected documents, and supported through a network of offshore finances and diplomatic privileges. DNA evidence, while preliminary and unverified publicly, suggested a biological link to the Kremlin's inner circle. But releasing that proof would mean exile, or worse. By 2015, the Kremlin's response to the mounting allegations had evolved into a precise, coordinated apparatus of information control. Spokespersons appeared on multiple state channels, their statements carefully scripted and synchronized across press conferences, morning talk shows, and official websites. Each reiterated a consistent message: all claims of a hidden heir or clandestine family ties were fabrications and hostile Western propaganda. Visual aids, charts, stock images of neutral landscapes, and official portraits accompanied the statements, reinforcing the narrative while avoiding direct references to specific individuals. Media outlets under state influence followed the script. Television anchors repeated the denials verbatim, often introducing segments with phrases like unfounded rumors or misinformation spread by foreign agents. Newspapers aligned with federal interests published op-eds condemning Western outlets for attempting to destabilize Russian society by fabricating stories about the president's private life. Each broadcast and article maintained uniform timing, creating the impression of a single, unbroken voice from the state apparatus. Legislation reinforced the media effort. Laws were introduced criminalizing public discussion or publication regarding the private lives of high-ranking officials. Journalists, bloggers, and online commentators faced potential fines, censorship, or imprisonment if they referenced unverified information about personal relationships or family members of government figures. These statutes applied retroactively in certain instances, enabling authorities to suppress previously published material swiftly and with legal justification. The result was immediate and chilling. Independent news outlets received formal warnings. Web domains hosting investigative content were temporarily seized, and servers were subjected to administrative blocks. Foreign journalists reporting from within Russia experienced intensified scrutiny, with visa restrictions and surveillance discouraging further inquiry. The net effect was a rapid erasure of both digital and print traces, outpacing any attempts by investigative teams to document or repost their findings. Amid this climate, an internal directive surfaced through a rare leak. A memorandum circulated to editors within state-aligned media explicitly instructing them not to mention Alina Kabaeva by name. The note emphasized that even indirect references could undermine the official denial. The memo read, in part, "Do not reference or speculate regarding Kabaeva in any publication. All mentions must be redacted or substituted with neutral identifiers. This applies to historical coverage and current reporting. Compliance is mandatory." The leak of this memo created an unintended paradox. Observers outside Russia noted that forbidding a name implied significance, contradicting repeated claims that the story was entirely fictitious. Analysts concluded that the directive reflected the Kremlin's dual strategy: control the narrative publicly while simultaneously eliminating all traces of key individuals internally. By silencing any mention of Kabaeva, the state minimized the risk of accidental corroboration while maintaining plausible deniability. Internally, the campaign functioned like a machine. Newsroom schedules were synchronized, press releases coordinated to appear simultaneously across multiple channels, and digital takedown orders executed through the Ministry of Communications and affiliated cyber units. Every post, broadcast, and article was monitored for compliance, and deviations were corrected swiftly. The effect was both comprehensive and psychologically coercive. Journalists learned quickly that any attempt to bypass the system could result in immediate professional and legal consequences. Yet cracks in the operation were evident to international analysts. The sheer intensity of suppression suggested the state perceived real threat in the allegations. If the story were entirely baseless, logic dictated a more passive response. The deliberate prohibition against naming Alina Kabaeva, combined with simultaneous media offensives, implied that elements of the narrative required containment rather than mere dismissal. The Kremlin's machinery had transformed denial into active warfare, a systematic, state-directed campaign to rewrite perception, erase records, and criminalize inquiry. Why forbid the name if the story is fiction? 5 years after the journalist's disappearance, the material she had painstakingly collected resurfaced in an unexpected location: an encrypted hard drive, stored in a nondescript metal cabinet in the archives of a Swiss investigative journalism collective. The drive bore no labels, only a sequence of numbers etched into the casing. Initial attempts to access its contents triggered multiple encryption layers, each requiring keys known only to the journalist. After weeks of painstaking forensic work, the files were finally unlocked, revealing an unfinished documentary, raw footage, and scattered notes, an echo of a story never meant to be fully told. The recovered footage was fragmentary. Early sequences contained long, silent pans of snowy Moscow streets, intercut with archival clips of the Kremlin, press briefings, and aerial shots of the Valdai region. Coordinates embedded in metadata pointed unmistakably to the lakeside estate. Time-coded voice memos, some barely audible over static, contained her meticulous observations, her assessment of security perimeters, the patterns of Federal Protective Service patrols, and her reflections on the logistical anomalies she had tracked. The documentary's narration drafts, typed and scanned, revealed the journalist's intent to maintain strict detachment. Lines describing diplomatic vehicles, shell companies, and school enrollment records were written in the clinical, third-person tone she had cultivated, a voice both forensic and archival, carrying the weight of months of careful investigation. The archival footage itself was inconsistent. Some frames were corrupted, others partially blurred, as though intentionally or incidentally altered during recording. One particular sequence drew immediate attention. A shot of a mansion interior, filmed from behind a tree at dusk, included a faint, blurred figure of a child moving through a corridor. The face was obscured, details indistinct, yet the presence was undeniable. Editors compiling the footage noted that this single frame was neither staged nor repeated elsewhere in the archive. Whether the child's appearance was accidental or a deliberate signal left by the journalist could not be determined. The effect was haunting. Her investigation, silenced for years, now whispered through pixels and shadows. Audio fragments captured her final recording session. At 1:42 a.m., her voice narrates a description of the estate's layout, mentioning the unusual frequency of arrivals and departures, before cutting mid-word as if interrupted, and the security patterns indicate that the drive contained no continuation. Metadata showed the last saved timestamp aligned with her disappearance, suggesting that she had either abandoned the recording or had been prevented from finishing it. The abrupt end lent the material a ghostly quality, a sentence suspended in time, mirroring the abrupt cessation of her investigation. Colleagues outside Russia began compiling the footage into an underground release. Each frame was treated as evidence, annotated and cross-referenced with existing Project Orion fragments. Even the corrupted segments were preserved, their imperfections reinforcing the narrative of a story forcibly interrupted. Audio engineers worked to clarify faint whispers and background noise, identifying patterns in the movement of cars, voices, and environmental sounds. Every recovered element reinforced her methodical approach and the precision of her archival work. The atmosphere surrounding the recovered files was somber and tense. Basements of archival vaults, filled with racks of servers and the hum of ventilation, became the temporary home of her voice. Flickering monitors cast shadows across assembled investigators, their eyes scanning each frame, each memo, each fragmentary audio log. The journalist's work, once silenced by state power, had re-emerged, unfinished, damaged, but undeniably present. And yet, the final frame lingered in the minds of all who viewed it. The blurred child's face in the dimly lit corridor. Was it an accident, or her last message? The investigation, now spanning nearly a decade, concluded not with definitive proof, but with a ledger of absences, fragments, and unanswered questions. Across Moscow, Geneva, and Zurich, the trail left by the journalist, her encrypted files, surveillance photographs, offshore records, and whispered testimonies, had been traced, analyzed, and reconstructed. Each element carried weight. The sudden erasure of media coverage, the precise timing of Project Orion leaks, the school records of children under assumed names, and the meticulous coordination of financial flows. Yet despite the accumulation of evidence, the story could never be fully verified. The facts existed in shadows, shaped as much by absence as by presence. Archives, both physical and digital, formed the skeleton of the narrative. Cold rooms lined with servers hummed in sterile precision as investigators pored over corrupted footage and metadata. Typewriter clicks from decades-old documents echoed in background recordings, a reminder that even the most modern surveillance tools cannot fully suppress what has been observed, annotated, or encoded. In these spaces, the patterns became clear. The Kremlin maintained a system in which secrecy was both armor and weapon. Personal histories, familial ties, and financial networks were shielded under layers of legal protection, digital interference, and direct censorship. Those who attempted to expose them, the journalist most of all, faced consequences extending to disappearance, coercion, and death. The human cost remained starkly visible. Journalists in modern Russia, particularly those probing high-level corruption or private presidential affairs, had disappeared, been imprisoned, or forced into exile. Their absence formed a silent ledger, a testament to the power wielded by a state capable of shaping narrative, erasing memory, and directing truth itself. The case of Project Orion illuminated the mechanisms by which information could be controlled: digital incursions, surveillance, diplomatic immunity, and coordinated propaganda campaigns. Every deletion, every forced resignation, and every closed file reinforced the reach of the system. Yet alongside this systemic violence was a persistence of memory. Fragments recovered in Switzerland and other safe jurisdictions allowed the story to exist outside immediate reach. The journalist's unfinished documentary, her encrypted memos, and the partial surveillance photographs functioned as ghostly testimony, proof that even the most comprehensive information suppression cannot fully obliterate observation. Analysts noted how each recovered fragment, each metadata timestamp, and each independently verified financial transaction connected like threads in a wider fabric, a network of secrecy sustained by privilege, fear, and institutional power. The narrative concluded with reflection rather than resolution. Verification, in its traditional sense, remained impossible. The children allegedly raised under diplomatic protection, the offshore accounts, the Valdai estate, and even the precise nature of the journalist's demise could not be confirmed beyond reasonable doubt. And yet the consequences of knowing, of documenting, of pursuing truth in a tightly controlled authoritarian system were tangible and undeniable. Fear, exile, and mortality marked every step. The cost of inquiry was as real as the fragments left behind. Then, in the final hours of assembling the archival dossier, an anonymous email appeared in the secure inbox of the investigative collective. Its sender claimed only to be from inside Valdai. The message contained no attachments, no identifying metadata, only a single line of text. You are closer than you know. Keep watching. It is not over. The statement carried the weight of continuity. It suggested that the narrative, suppressed and fractured as it was, persisted within the very structures it sought to expose. That someone, or something, inside the corridors of power was aware, monitoring, and perhaps waiting to see what would unfold next. The story, the investigation, and the lives it touched existed in a space of tension between evidence and erasure, observation and control. Though the narrative had been meticulously documented, the conclusion offered neither certainty nor finality. It was a record of consequence, a testament to the risks inherent in pursuing truth under authoritarian oversight. And so, the story begins again. The investigation has uncovered fragments of a story the world was never meant to see. Hidden estates, encrypted files, offshore accounts, and children living in shadows, all pointing to a truth that may never be fully verified. But one thing is certain: secrecy and power always come at a cost. If you want to follow more stories that the world tries to bury, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us as we uncover the hidden histories they don't want you to know. Remember, some secrets are never truly gone, and this story is far from over.